Yeah. Okay, so welcome everybody. Thank you very much for tuning in to the first of our seminars for this spring term. Our guest speaker this evening is Adam David Morton, who's a professor of political economy in the Department of Political Economy at the University of Sydney in Australia. But Adam was formerly of the University of Nottingham, and he's actually a former co-director of the Centre for the Study of Social and Global Justice, and has done a lot of work with Andreas Bieler, who's one of the current co-directors. He's published a lot, so I won't bore you with saying too much about that. Just draw your attention to some of the things he's done, either on his own, this very well-known book on Gramsci, Unraveling Gramsci, and of course his work on the state in modern Mexico. But he's also done work with Andreas, again on Gramsci, first of all, but latter, actually you can't see it on my slide because well, perhaps you can, but I can't, all the people down the side of my slide. But the most recent thing that he's done with Andreas is a book in 2018 entitled Global Capitalism, Global War and Global Crisis. And that will do for the introduction. We don't need, I'm sure you won't be offended if I don't say too much about him. We'll just let him get on with it. I think I need to find a way of actually making this go. Stop sharing. There we are. Okay, very good. Right, so the format is this. We've got about an hour and a half. So Adam's going to talk, well, I'm not sure exactly how long, but 45 minutes or so. And then we'll have half an hour for discussion. And we always finish at 7:30. And Adam's PowerPoint presentation, and the title is Mainstreaming Marxism on the Anarchic Structure of the World Economy. So it's a big pleasure, Adam, that you're here. Thank you very much, especially because it's so early in the morning in Australia. So off you go.
Thanks very much, Tony, for that excellent introduction. And it's great to be in the company of CSSGJ comrades for sure, and to see lots of familiar faces in the tiles. I do have a PowerPoint presentation, but it's not extensive, so it will just resonate with the key moments. But before that, there is an origin story to the paper, as with all of our work, which actually resonates out of CSSGJ itself, and importantly, the Marxism reading group, which Andreas has convened now for a number of years and has involved many participants in and through CSSGJ. And I recall reading one of the foci in the paper through the reading group, which is Nikolai Bukharin's Imperialism and World Economy. And I had a copy of the book under my arm, and I was walking to the seminar room where we would always meet. And I bumped into a colleague, Sue Price, and she said, "Where are you going?" And I said, "I'm going to the Marxism reading group." And she said, "Poor you." But the point of this story is to actually exalt the importance of collective reading groups, because out of that intellectual space, that collective intellectual space of reading Bukharin over 10 years ago, came the kernel of this particular idea for today's paper. And it was left on the shelf for a while, but it just shows you how our subconscious, I think, works through ideas to then realize them. And in realizing the paper, it came through an invitation, actually, which I don't often receive, believe it or not, from a mainstream colleague, George Lawson, now at the Australian National University, who wanted me to engage with mainstream questions about world order. And this is the paper that I came up with, and I'll get into the intellectual trajectory of it very, very shortly. So let me just switch a little bit with my tiles and organize things. So that's the origin story of the paper. Pretty straightforward in the sense that it was something that came from a long time ago and is now finally seeing daylight. Okay, my essential question that I want to deliver today, and I haven't haven't got my slides, there we go, to deliver today is, what if in 1936 David Davies had not appointed E.H. Carr as the Woodrow Wilson Professor of International Politics at the University of Wales, Aberystwyth, but instead had appointed a black radical in C.L.R. James? And if C.L.R. James had accepted, which he may not have done, given that he was radical, how different would the self-image of international theory now look today? So this is actually a question I finished the paper with, but for presentation purposes, I think it works better to start with. Would there exist today a C.L.R. James chair at the University of Wales, Aberystwyth, rather than the E.H. Carr chair, which is currently occupied by Milja Kirky? This counterfactual question seems extremely daft, but is it really? In 1932, James had arrived in England and embarked on his cricket journalism for The Guardian while living in Nelson, known as Red Nelson in Lancashire, probably not far away from where Tony Burns was knocking around, hopefully not in 1932. And C.L.R. James was living there with Leary Constantine. It was in this period subsequently that he would write Beyond a Boundary. More importantly, in my regard, by 1937, James had published World Revolution, 1917 to 1936, his magnum opus on the interwar years, and a period which he refers to in the book as, quote unquote, the most turbulent 20 years in all history. I think this had an impression on Carr, who wrote, obviously, The 20 Years Crisis, which was published a couple of years later in 1939. But before that time, alongside World Revolution 1917 to 1936, James also realizes Black Jacobins, published in 1938, and an important book which became The History of Pan-African Revolt, again also published in 1938. What C.L.R. James is doing in this early work is reflecting on the conditions of world revolution. And indeed, for the journal International Affairs, E.H. Carr devoured James's book on world revolution as a reviewer in order to scoff at it. And I quote from that 1937 review, "It is a dogmatic and controversial but decidedly useful book." I bet it was, E.H. Carr. He then goes on to say, albeit one that exhibits a rather pathetic faith in the salvation of the world by the Fourth International, end quote. In a path-breaking essay entitled Lenin and the Problem, written by C.L.R. James in 1964 for his book Nkrumah and the Ghana Revolution, James notes that the dilemmas of uneven development have not so much disappeared from history or not been forgotten, and then I quote, because they have never been noticed. Perhaps striking back then for that 1937 review in International Affairs, James goes on to argue that even, and I quote, in the authoritative and extensive examinations of the whole Russian Revolution by Isaac Deutscher and E.H. Carr, you find the same blank incomprehension on the issue of uneven development and world revolution. So how is it then that the insights of C.L.R. James can be marginalized within the mid-century self-image of international theory by somebody as prominent as E.H. Carr? And so I guess the bigger macro question that I have in the paper is that are there broader silenced trajectories that lie at the very intellectual roots of the discipline of international relations and international political economy? And of course, I'm going to say yes, because otherwise I could go back to bed. Ramping up the stakes in relation to that question a little bit, what if some of the very gilt-edged theories of mainstream international relations thinking actually had their radical counterparts within Marxist alternatives? So that's the broadening out really from E.H. Carr and C.L.R. James, which I'll talk about shortly. I want to argue today in my talk that there are indeed at least two pathways, and you can probably think of others, that reveal these sorts of silences and exclusions that go, I think, to the center of international theory. First, reeling matters back a little bit, I will look at the theory of international anarchy proposed by Kenneth Waltz, and then his more radical counterpart in the work of Nikolai Bukharin, with the latter focus in relation to Bukharin, looking at the anarchical structure of world capitalism. And then second, I'll return in a little bit more detail to this juxtaposition on world revolution between E.H. Carr and C.L.R. James as the radical counterpart, and the way in which James treated world revolution, but inclusive of the racialized and the class conditions of uneven development. So in terms of the paper, my argument is that rather than marginal to the mainstream, these Marxist alternatives have similar but more radical takes on the anarchic structure of the world economy and world revolution. Moreover, my argument is that these contending mainstream approaches can be revealed, maybe controversially, as the slavish breed of imitators that they are when it comes to their more radical counterparts. So famously within IR theory, Susan Strange delivered this paper with a bit of Latin in it, and that had an impression on me, which I've tried to basically evoke today. For Susan Strange, it was Cave hic dragones, beware, here be dragons. My clarion call today is imitatores servum pecus, imitators you slavish breed, with Waltz and Carr cast as these pale imitators of their Marxist counterparts, in comparison to Bukharin and James, who radically rethink, I think, the history of world order. So our journey today is to raise these voices about capitalism from outside the accepted speaking space of world order that enables me first to juxtapose the work of Kenneth Waltz and Nikolai Bukharin on their competing understandings of anarchic orders. And I'll come back to the importance of this focus on juxtaposition as a method very shortly. Erased from the inner structure of world order has been the anarchical structure of capitalism as actually constitutive of the world economy. So retelling the theory of anarchy necessitates positioning Bukharin as central with his theorizing on imperialism and world economy to the mid-century history of IR and IPE. Second, there is a meeting up of Carr and James and their weighty understandings of world revolution, which spatializes the theory of world order even further. For the latter thinker in C.L.R. James, this is especially so in relation to what he focused on, which was the self-activity of subaltern classes, and then significantly the raciality of imperialism. As will be revealed, the work of Bukharin on imperialism is quite unique in internally relating capitalistic and territorial or geo-economic and geopolitical logics of power. And I'll come back to that internality and its significance later in the paper, and it obviously builds on the joint work with Andreas Bieler in Global Capitalism, Global War, Global Crisis. Meanwhile, the work of James geographically reaches from the Atlantic through to Pan-Africanism to provide an alternative critique of capitalism and a reconstruction of Black radicalism, but again on the self-activity of subaltern classes. In a fresh manner then, my approach hopefully juxtaposes key figures that have been present, Waltz and Carr, and absent, Bukharin and James, in understanding world order through the anarchic structure of the world market and racial capitalism. And by so doing, hopefully these familiar figures and their distinct construction of the rise and fall of world orders can be revealed that speak to the past and also present debates on racial capitalism, but more importantly, they are revealed as these pale imitators of their radical Marxist counterparts. By way of conclusion, my argument then extends the case for a necessarily historical materialist moment in understanding world order, which builds on the book that I've just mentioned with Andreas, Global Capitalism, Global War, Global Crisis. In the conclusion, by asserting the necessity of historical materialism to analyzing the anarchically structured world economy and racial capitalism, contending mainstream approaches can then be revealed as this slavish breed of imitators when it comes to understanding the mid-century history and the ongoing present of IR and international political economy. So that's the roadmap of where we're going. But before we get to that, I just want to give a note on method, which draws its inspiration from this book by Juliet Hooker, Theorizing Race in the Americas. So I've just got one slide to say a few words about this note on method, how I came across this book, and why I think it's really useful for looking at this quartet of thinkers. As you can see from the front cover, Juliet Hooker has her own quartet in Theorizing Race, and she juxtaposes these four thinkers in a particular way. So it's really the note on method, which I find quite inspirational. What does she say about this method of juxtaposition? She asks a very simple question in the introduction: what happens when thinkers and traditions that are viewed as disparate are staged as proximate, and what insights are revealed by aligning what might be seen as previously discrepant thinkers alongside each other? So this question is really pertinent for the scaffolding, I think, of Bukharin vis-a-vis Waltz and C.L.R. James vis-a-vis E.H. Carr. And my attention to Juliet Hooker's work was actually drawn as a result of a colleague, Ian Brough at the University of Manchester, who published this really, I think, important article in Environment and Planning A on the politics of comparing capitalisms. And when I first read this article, it didn't grip me as much as it does now, actually. And I think what Ian does is this wonderful job of originally drawing from Juliet Hooker's work as a method of thinking through, in his case, comparing capitalisms, but for me, in comparing these quartet of thinkers. And I would recommend anybody that's looking for methodological substance for engaging with questions of political economy to turn to Ian Brough's particular piece here. As a summary then, juxtaposition reads thinkers alongside each other. They might be previously discrepant thinkers, but then they can be nested and paired methodologically to raise new questions and reflections. And that's really what I'm up to today, hopefully. Okay, to get into the anarchic structure of world economy, for all the attention on world order and its supposed condition of anarchy, Waltz's treatment of theories of imperialism is surely most revealing about the privileged angle of vision and the taking over of space that it has achieved. Even for a figure such as Ken Booth, a critical intellectual, and I quote from Ken here, Waltzian structural realism remains the most persuasive theory explaining the continuous causal weight of the international of world politics. That was written in 2014. But my question is, could there be a theory of the causal weight of the international predicated on the anarchy of the world market? Now, most interestingly, to be sure, in Theory of International Politics, Waltz engages with Nikolai Bukharin, perhaps surprisingly, and he accepts the latter's novelty in positing the ever-thickening networks of interdependence in world economy. So not only Nikolai Bukharin, but figures such as Trotsky were thinking through interdependence by using that very, very term in the 1910s and into the 1920s. An issue actually that misses a lot of the debate in international political economy by the 1970s, when figures such as Robert Cohen think they're being original by thinking through the conditions of complex interdependence. So my question is, in terms of thinking through this connection between Waltz and Bukharin, what is overlooked and if not silenced in relation to Bukharin's originality? And in particular, in thinking through the intertwining of capital and territory within the anarchic structure of world economy. Now, famously for Waltz, he exalts the principles of parsimony in theory construction. So taking a few severely simple axioms in order to explain a lot about world politics or world order. So he has a form of abstraction which others such as Derek Sayer, and I'll mention this continuously throughout the presentation, might call a violent abstraction because of the severely simple assumptions that underpin this process of theory construction. Now, importantly for Waltz, in exalting the principles of parsimony, he thinks he then produces an elegant theory. And we'll get into maybe the cost of that, that simplicity and whether it is still elegant or not through this first half of the presentation. So for Waltz, the order of anarchy is an ordering principle, a parsimonious principle at the international level that operates as an imperative, this condition of anarchy that then shapes and shoves states within a self-help system of survival, a war of all against all. To give you one quote from the text, the enduring anarchic character of international politics accounts for the striking sameness in the quality of international life throughout the millennia, a statement that Waltz thinks will meet with wide assent. So these imperatives of anarchy, whereby the international system underpins the compulsions of survival and as a structure shapes and shoves states as their units, are to be read, I think, and critiqued through what Waltz leans on, which is a market allegory. I argue that the structural theory of international politics projects a normative dimension in the form of its leaning on this market allegory. The story is one of states as units in a system operating as firms in a market economy, as an allegory of the embattled situation of survival with recurrent violence. So what Waltz does is he teases from microeconomic theory, but obviously a particular form of microeconomic theory, as a go-to or prop for his broader thinking about world order and the role of states. My argument is that the market allegory is the fulcrum of structural realism, where the system-wide condition of anarchy is deemed to shape states, just as it is assumed to shape the compulsions of rival firms within economic theory. This process of market allegorization in Waltz's book, Theory of International Politics, is explicit. So the allegorical structure of international theory as a story of market structure is a normative conscious move, I would argue, within his presentation. To give you another quote, market structure is defined by counting firms, international political structure by counting states. So he sees them as directly analogous. In the counting, distinctions are made only according to capabilities. Perhaps in one of the most dubious uses of market allegory, given the actual transformations in state formation that followed, Waltz stretches this theoretical elegance to a deeply unattractive extreme. And I'll give you the quote. Few states die, many firms do. Who is likely to be around 100 years from now? The United States, the Soviet Union, France, Egypt, Thailand, and Uganda. Or Ford, IBM, Shell, Unilever, and Massey Ferguson. I would bet on the states, perhaps even Uganda, with a pejorative finish there. Excuse me. But rather than this set of violent abstractions, turning to Marx in volume 3 of Capital, he argued that, and I quote, it is a false abstraction to treat a nation whose mode of production is based on value and organized capitalistically into the bargain as a unified body simply working for the national needs, end quote. By extension, in the hands of Bukharin, it is Bukharin that offers a structural theory of anarchy, but one that moves way beyond these simplistic, crude, false, or violent abstractions. So to quote from Imperialism and World Economy, the anarchic character of capitalist society is expressed in the fact that social economy is not an organized collective body guided by a single will, but a system of economies interconnected through exchange, each of which produces at its own risk, never being in a position to adapt itself more or less to the volume of social demand and to the production carried on in individual economies. And this is the interesting twist. This calls forth a struggle of the economies against each other, a war of capitalist competition. So for Bukharin, the world economy is taken as a dialectical unity as a totality within which there is an internal relation between the totality of capitalism, or the anarchy of the world market, and its parts constituted by state forms. So to give you another quote from Imperialism and World Economy in our times is characterized by its highly anarchic structure. This anarchic structure of world capitalism is expressed in two facts: world industrial crises on the one hand, wars on the other. Now, it's probably good that ChatGPT wasn't around when Kenneth Waltz was writing, because it's almost as if this very quotation has had a direct impression, I would argue, on Waltz's thinking in theory of international politics. Yet for Bukharin, the anarchy of capitalist competition is a structuring principle or ordering principle at the scale of world order, which there is embedded within it a fusion of state forms and capital concentrations. So rather than simply leaning on a market allegory, the anarchical structure of capitalism in the hands of Bukharin is theorized instead by relating internally military struggle and capital accumulation. They're not a binary in Bukharin's thinking. So capitalist world order therefore drives with elemental regularity in his view, and as a compulsory law, both military rivalry and economic competition between capitals. Moreover, instead of the reliance on a simple market allegorizing, Bukharin states, and I quote, that the law of value expresses itself as the elemental regulator of socio-productive life within the anarchical structure of capitalism, which then drives competition between capitals and military rivalries among states. So to sum up this section, it is as if, in my view, that Bukharin has been airbrushed from the history of theorizing on anarchic orders, purged once again as before, not by Stalin, but this time by Kenneth Waltz, by the mainstream of political science. And I kind of like that sweep from Joseph Stalin to Kenneth Waltz, which I've just passed by you there. Okay, to turn to CLR James and E.H. Carr. If the first of my imitators came firmly from the mainstream of American political science, in the figure of Kenneth Waltz, then the second thinker to beware of derives from the revered origin story of the discipline of international politics itself, in the form of E.H. Carr. Maybe I should have prefaced the presentation with the fact that I did my graduate studies at the University of Wales in Aberystwyth. So it was almost as if we were force-fed E.H. Carr continually, but it wasn't a text that really excited or resonated much with me. So this is perhaps my ode to Aberystwyth for that cod liver oil that we were fed as graduate students. In terms of more contemporary debates, I think Randall Germain has published a couple of really interesting articles, one in International Studies Quarterly and one in the Review of International Studies, which has made a compelling case to return to Carr as someone who offers a pathway for thinking through political economy in order to connect the world economy, its institutions, and its intersubjective meanings. My reading instead covers Carr's reflections on political economy through a focus on 1, world revolution, 2, what he calls the creed of laissez-faire with direct echoes of Karl Polanyi, 3, planned economy, and 4, geopolitics. Now, of course, I'm not going to go into all of the detail of that, but I'll just put up this one quotation from the 20 Years Crisis, which I think is revealing. He says, during the interwar period, the struggle was intensified by the creation of new states and new economic frontiers. So, the most important of all, there were no more open spaces anywhere awaiting cheap and profitable development and exploitation. So the interwar period in terms of rivalry and conflict was explained by this supposed contraction of space, obviously through conditions of imperialism. My aim in terms of this retrieval, though, is not to celebrate E.H. Carr, but ultimately to side with Tamara Deutsch's conclusion that, quote, Carr seemed a 19th century liberal who had become exceedingly impatient with the anarchy of modern capitalism. And that's from Tamara Deutsche, who is actually a friend and a colleague of E.H. Carr as well. So rather than Carr's bricolage, my attention in the presentation is cast towards C.L.R. James and his corpus, which is treated as a coherent totality that provides a radical pathway, in my view, to political economy through a consideration of four factors again: world revolution, geopolitics, class struggle, and black resistance. And I emphasize treating C.L.R. James's work as a coherent totality because I think it resists the conclusion of people, for example, like Cedric Robinson in his book Black Marxism, who argues that C.L.R. James renounced his earlier Marxism and retreated away from his earlier work. That's very much a reading that I would reject, and I would treat C.L.R. James's corpus as a coherent totality. My conclusion here, as a little insight, is that James offers a reconstruction of racial capitalism, but importantly not, as feminist Selma James says, who was also, they were also partners, not as some sort of cultural guru, but rather as a black radical who addresses the self-activity of class struggle. And I'll come back to that later in this half of the presentation. To return to that 1937 text that I opened up with, World Revolution 1917 to 1936, this is a book that clearly sets out the methodological assertion of the structuring conditions of world revolution and uneven development. And James treats these as central to understanding the anarchical law of value and the project of decolonization. The focus in the book on Abyssinia is pivotal to all of this. Although somewhat forgotten today, the book is also regarded as part of a classic Marxist trilogy, alongside Trotsky's The Revolution Betrayed and Victor Serge's Russia 20 Years After, which were all published in 1937. So these strands of world revolution, uneven development, and the black radical tradition in C.L.R. James's work then get carried through into Black Jacobins and Nkrumah and the Ghana Revolution. In the former book, James grasped the centrality of the slave trade and black resistance, as well as the class dynamics of abolition, to such a degree that his study of Atlantic slavery is regarded as an outstanding treatment of the theory of uneven and combined development. And again, I would argue, as an aside, that even within contemporary debates on uneven and combined development, C.L.R. James is again, once more, expunged from the record as an original thinker of that particular condition. The Haitian Revolution from 1791 to 1804 against French colonial rule forced the abolition of slavery as an issue and reconfigured the whole geopolitics of the world economy, following the abolition of the slave trade in 1807 and then formal slave emancipation in 1833, but formally. Two features then of this focus on black resistance have to be regarded, I think, from the pages of the Black Jacobins as really significant. First, the study of revolution in San Domingo, the present-day Haiti, was articulated as an endeavor to reveal more and more of its affinity with revolutions in more developed communities. So James has got this really important intersocietal connection going on when he looks at revolution. In a recursive move, it was also evident, this focus on uneven development, through the violent conflicts of his then present. So what he tries to do is connect the circumstances of world revolution that would then enable him to focus on the very bones of previous revolutions and their connection to the present more easily. In the Black Jacobins, then, there is an anatomy of revolution in San Domingo, which is detailed and addressed as one of the pathways through which through which revolutionary processes can unfold. Secondly, importantly in this book, racial divisions are not elevated at the exclusion of class conditions. And I think this is perhaps the most important message that James provides for us. So this really crucial question, which I know animates others, the race question is subsidiary to the class question in politics, and to think of imperialism in terms of race is disastrous. And then he flips it, but to neglect the racial factor as merely incidental is an error only less grave than to make it fundamental. So again, race and class are importantly irreducible to each other when thinking through forms of imperialism and domination. The dialectic of both Black resistance and class struggle has to therefore be centered within the roots of Black radicalism. Hence why in San Domingo and across all revolutionary France, there was a virulent hatred for the colonial whites, which were referred in the documents, the primary materials that James consulted, as the aristocrats of the skin. So race and class are inextricably intertwined. In Nkrumah and the Ghana Revolution, these two features of Black resistance resurface. Once again, a consistent emphasis on uneven development emerges, and the concomitant pressures of developmental catch-up are highlighted. Black radicalism was obviously at work in the Ghanaian Revolution because, to quote from James, the racial consciousness which has been so mercilessly injected into the Negro is today a source of action and at the same time discipline. So again, through the social structures emergent from racial capitalism becomes this focus in James on the agential force and the self-activity of subaltern classes. To quote again from Nkrumah and the Ghana Revolution, the basis of this unity was not in its black skins, but the unity of the conditions under which it lived, which cemented the power of the revolution in Ghana. As summed up in James and his conversation with Trotsky in Coyoacán in Mexico in 1939, Marxist analysis gives an insight into the development of Black liberation like nothing else can, he states, quote unquote, especially when it comes to the basis of economic struggle and the fight for the abolition of racial discrimination. So the citizen of the Black Atlantic in CLR James developed a critique of contemporary capitalism in his era and reconstructed the history of Black radicalism as of a piece, as all part and parcel of class emancipation. An important bookend to this emphasis is CLR James's analysis of Moby Dick in his quite slender volume, Mariners, Renegades and Castaways, published in 1953. For James, Moby Dick the book, with its reflections on the selling of dry human heads as curios, its ruminations on scalping, and its representation of whiteness as a synecdoche for barbarism, comes to represent the imperial vision at the heart of civilization, and, to quote from James, the extermination of the alien as a malignant pest. In the novel Moby Dick, there is a history for James of the untold blood and treasure of the modern social hell of capital and its origins in the condition of primitive accumulation, which he traces throughout this text. So here we have CLR James embarking on literary economy to reveal the racialization processes at the center of Moby Dick and therefore the world market conditions of capitalism. And for me, as an aside, this is extremely interesting because you get CLR James interested in Moby Dick as a novel that's written in the 1850s to reflect on the conquest and plunder of the oceans, which resonates directly in my thinking with Cormac McCarthy's book, Blood Meridian, written in 1985, but contextually based also in the 1850s, that looks at the conquest and plunder on the land, adjacent to the circumstances of Moby Dick, and similarly thinking through the conditions of thievery, primitive accumulation, and scalping on the US-Mexico frontier. Okay, to sum up, a quip once from Carr was that theories die hard and frequently outlive the conditions out of which they arose, something which I think, with a little bit of irony, could be applied to Carr himself. My contribution here has been hopefully to reflect on two main accounts of theorizations of world order that have been dominant at the expense of excluded and silenced contributions. These two accounts of die-hard theories have been, one, the anarchical theory of world order offered by Waltz, and two, the pathway to political economy and world revolution offered by Carr himself. My argument has been that these two approaches to world order have been mainstreamed at the expense of contributions to Marxist political economy. Controversially, then, these balance of power takes on the international system, in my regard at least, can be regarded as imitators of the more complex critical theorists that they echo, namely Bukharin and James. The thinkers tackled today, all four of them, in fact, all display a certain level of organic intellectuality, which are reflected in the traditions that they interpret. So obviously, Waltz is a theorist of geopolitics embedded within the US Academy. Carr and James I'll come to shortly, Bukharin within the Soviet Union. So all four of these thinkers have a certain level of organic intellectuality. Emblematic here is Carr's stress in What is History, published in 1960, where he reflects on those peoples which have succeeded in organizing their society in some degree and cease to be primitive savages in order to enter into history. So what sort of organic intellectual activity does this book reflect? As a set of lectures written in Cambridge for the George Macaulay Trevelyan Lectures, What is History, I think, again, can be usefully juxtaposed directly with what C.L.R. James was producing at exactly that time. In 1960, C.L.R. James produced the volume Modern Politics, which was a series of lectures he gave at the Adult Education Centre, not at Cambridge, but in Port of Spain, Trinidad, for a wider public audience, and then published as Modern Politics. This book, which was actually suppressed in its home country, resonates with the theme of subaltern class self-activity through Black radicalism, class struggle, and interestingly in this book, the women's movement as well in shaping modern politics. As Lenin surmised, we have here, I think, the clear divide between armchair force on the one hand, in the hands of E.H. Carr, and the living, active force on the other hand, in the hands of C.L.R. James. Rather than turning our necks back to the mainstream, though, what if, as a final word, we can assert then the necessarily historical materialist moment within our engagements in international theory? What about a genuinely Marxist curiosity in engaging with and addressing some of the existing blind spots and exclusions in IR and IPE? Can we move, importantly, I think, beyond criticism in the form of parody when it comes to Marxism as the continual excluded other? And can all of this generate a gate opening move to Marxism rather than a gatekeeping move from Marxism, especially on the subject of racial capitalism today, which is my hope, and I will leave that as the final word. Thank you.
Can you hear us, Tony?
Let's hope Tony got the last 35 minutes at least.
Yeah. I've just are you on mute, Tony? Perhaps.
Yeah, I think he's because he's there we go.
There
Okay, sorry, my computer misbehaved. I do apologize. Brilliant. Okay, thank you very much for that, Adam. So now we'll open it up for discussions, questions. I'm on my laptop, and I don't usually do it, so I'm not quite sure. I presume I'll see a hand if it goes up. If somebody raises a hand, that will flag up with me, I guess. Well, let's just see how we go. So over to you. Questions, comments? Yes, Chris Hesketh. Thank you very much, Chris.
Hi, Adam. So my question is this, and it kind of riffs a little bit on how you actually just ended the paper, which was, we could think of a couple of landmark monographs in particular that have sought to question the kind of foundational origin story of international relations, or a couple of special edition IPE journals that have tried to kind of draw attention to kind of various blind spots within international political economy. Likewise, this paper is trying to look at exclusions and silenced voices, if you like. So what do you kind of regard as the social function, if you like, of this paper in mainstreaming Marxism?
So shall we do them one by one, Adam? Unless you want me to collect together two or three, but it'll give other people time to think about.
let's go through a few looseners and see if a few more hands go up. But I don't think we can collect what doesn't exist. So let's just run with Chris's question and then take it from there. It's a really good question, Chris. It's on the one hand a deceptively straightforward question, but on the other hand an extremely expansive and difficult question to answer. I think on the one hand, with those special issues that have come out in looking at blind spots in IPE, and this is a personal reflection maybe as much as a political reflection, Marxism is still excluded from those sorts of collections. So to be expected, there's a very predominant focus from constructivist thinking, certainly from an identity politics perspective. Maybe at times feminism is included, but that's always a little bit conjunctural. But very rarely, I think, does one see prominent figures within Marxist political economy present in those collections, or even the new work that might be coming through by early career researchers. So I think for me there's a very deliberate exclusion of what I would see as the usual suspects in terms of Marxist intellectual thinkers that I would revere and value, or new early career researchers coming through. And in terms of those landmark monographs, I think there is now, which your own conversations have added to and helped me understand, there is now an emerging, over the last, say, 5 to 10 years, set of reflections on the origins of international relations and its basis in reflecting on a white world order, to put it bluntly, and to echo one of the titles of certainly Robert Vitalis's book. So this piece is a kind of fellow traveler, I think, to those reflections on white world order, to assert the focus on the exclusions at the heart of the discipline of international relations at its point of very creation, and indeed to reveal not only politically and practically how a white world order was constructed, but how it not only excluded cognate Marxist thinking, but consciously, I think, also borrowed from it as well. That's the subtext of my paper, which is hard to prove, but ultimately that thinkers like Waltz were clearly drawing from Bukharin, and most certainly thinkers such as E.H. Carr as revealed in that 1937 Review of International Affairs, were clearly continually, for Carr, because he was such an inveterate note writer and reader, drawing from their Marxist counterparts. So the argument is both that there's an exclusion at the heart of that discipline, as well as a borrowing, which I think is really interesting.
Okay, thank you. So, any more? Andreas.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Adam, for the excellent paper. I like the way you bring Bukharin and CLR James to the discussions. Yeah, in a way, revive their work because they have been overlooked, pushed aside by the mainstream. But in a way, I mean, should we be surprised that the mainstream pushes aside those debates? I mean, these exclusions have been there all the time. They continue to be there. So the pushing aside perhaps is not such a surprise. And then the question is, how does one respond to that? And so one could go into their own niche and keep on working there, or what's your suggestion in that respect vis-a-vis the mainstream? Yeah, because as you pointed out, even those engagement which try to overcome these blind spots, even they continue with certain exclusions. So it's more a question of strategy of how to move, within academia.
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. I think, so again, this is a personal reflection of one kind of born of frustration. One can peer review an article for a leading journal, Review of International Political Economy, and as you can probably guess, this isn't a hypothetical example. This is a real example on state theory. Okay, so one would expect to see in that piece on state theory for a leading journal certain authorities, whether you agree with them or disagree with them. And for me, I would expect to see Bob Jessup in that company among others. But what continually surprises me is when one's peer reviewing a piece written from the mainstream, is again how a submission can be crafted, not with an acknowledgement of that work that's then footnoted maybe as a sidebar and then dismissed, but not even engaged whatsoever. So that, you know, that's probably what staggers me the most, is that these exclusions can be so blatant. I guess the strategy, apart from pulling out one's non-existent hair, is that there are always these mainstream concepts and theories, in my regard, which have their analogous Marxist counterpart. So to give you another example, I use the term organic intellectual at the end of the paper. Within IR theory, there's an interesting debate about how ideas come about, and the debate is tried to address the basis of structural power that might shape discourse, basically. And so the agency that's highlighted as significant in articulating discourses is this notion of norm entrepreneurs. Sounds fantastic, funky, new, innovative, gets published in international organization, one of the most prominent mainstream political science journals one could think of. But for me, in my readership, norm entrepreneurs doesn't get you anywhere near the power of the concept of organic intellectuals, which is exactly what they're referring to. So again, you can see in the hands of the mainstream, something which is seen as innovative, as contemporary and fresh, has a long history, trajectory, and lineage. So I guess in terms of a strategy, and it's perhaps a somewhat uncomfortable one, as a critical scholar, we always feel incumbent upon ourselves to engage with the mainstream, to need to defer to the revered texts, and to demonstrate that within our knowledge. And yet that courtesy is not accorded to Marxist critical thinking at the same time. So there are two strategies, I guess. One is to just dump the mainstream, and Roland Bleicher famously says, forget IR theory. That might be a good option. That might not get you appointed on a committee for a lectureship. Or you could demonstrate how the mainstream is continually in dialogue with Marxism. And in my view, Marxism offers tools methodologically, politically, intellectually, that can transcend the limitations of the mainstream, which is often based on binary dualisms, on theorizing concepts as externally related and then trying to connect them, famously the state and the market, but actually fails to get at their complex dynamics. So I think there are two tactics there. One might be a little bit more strategic in building a future career as a form of engagement, and politically demonstrating the power of Marxism.
Okay, thank you very much. So I've got two questions next, one from Oliver Dodd and then from Andy Higginbottom. So Oliver first.
Just Andy, is yours your question in relation to what's just been said? Because mine's going off top to a different topic a bit. First.
I'm going to try and formulate this is a question, but it's kind of like, believe it or not, it's 3 or 4 overlapping thoughts, which I'll try and sort of distill. A very generative, very suggestive paper. Thank you very much for it. I actually understood international relations foundational origin story as really being a response to Lenin, in the sense of, Wilson's right of nations to self-determination in the middle of the First World War. So, I mean, there's a sort of like a foundational imitation going on of the whole discipline. And that kind of like is a way into what I'm slightly want to say. I mean, the substantive point of Bukharin's work is one of the 4 classical theories of imperialism. And you rightly draw attention to it. But I think we should be thinking about developing it much more, is what is the internal relation between the political and the economic, between the state and markets, if you like that. And it does seem to me to be, let's go into what Bukharin has to say about that a bit more, because that is the big difference, which is, Marxism explains the internal relations from a class perspective, as I think we completely agree. But I think I'd like to get a bit more of the substance of that, really. And so, again, related to that, I actually think pale imitation works the other way as well. And a lot of academic Marxism has actually accepted quite Weberian type concepts, which move it away from any sense of holistic internal relation. I mean, I'm thinking of Kalinikos's work and even, Harvey's work, this idea that the world system is like political competition and economic competition, which somehow externally interact. I mean, these are the doyens of contemporary Marxism, right? And that have Weberian arguments, basically. So it seems to me that it's quite a big challenge going the other way. And for me, uneven combined development really doesn't cut it at all, right? Because it's not a theory of imperialism. It's a sort of a rather generic sense of dialectics. I mean, so there's a big challenge here, which is to go to the classic theories of imperialism, definitely including Bukharin, and try to bring them up to date. So I know that's like a lot of related points, but yeah. But beware pale imitations on both sides, I suppose.
No, I think that's a great point, Andy, and great to see you also again. You look in fine fettle. Yeah, I agree. I think let's maybe just start with Bukharin and Kalinikos. So I actually reread Kalinikos's. I think it's a really important book. Whose title now escapes me. It's something in imperialism,
global political economy, or something like that.
Yeah, imperialism and global political economy. I think Kalinikos has a really, really good reading of Bukharin in that text, but for me, the interest starts to fall off when he tries to run with Bukharin's own theorizing on the anarchic structure of world capitalism, because as you've hinted, Andy, he collapses into the very binary distinctions which in Bukharin's hands are internally related, so the capital and the territorial logics. And in the hands of somebody like, and so maybe this is a tough ambition to match, but in the hands of somebody like Bukharin or Luxemburg, obviously also Marx, the way in which they dialectically treat their concepts, but also their history, is very, very powerful. And so the challenge incumbent upon us is to emulate that. And I think that the book by Kalinikos on imperialism and global political economy actually falls short, and he collapses into a very state-centric account then of geopolitics, which does smuggle in, I think, this neo-Weberian treatment of key concepts as externally related or as binary dualisms. So I would also then agree that the wider literature on uneven and combined development, in a way, if I can say in the company presently, is a sanitization of Marxism. The law of value, which James makes reference to, and which is the red thread, I think, that connects back to Bukharin as well, in terms of the substance that you were hinting at. The law of value is precisely what's missing in the contemporary international relations debates on uneven and combined development. It gets absolutely no mention in the work, for example, of Justin Rosenberg. And I think that for a more sophisticated account of imperialism, and this is going to lead down the garden path to a completely different debate now, I think, but for a focus and a reflection on the conditions of imperialism and uneven development, the law of value is the distinguishing difference between a Marxist political economy approach and that sort of violent set of abstractions based on the market allegorizing in the hands of somebody like Waltz. It's really the law of value which is the divider. That's the point that I want to make there. And maybe that's the difference between focusing on Marxist forms of international relations and a more radical political economy. Now that opens up the question then is, okay, how is value constituted, through what interactions and spaces and so on. But I think that that's always a crucial political economy question, which raises the difference between maybe the classics of Marxist thinking and the epigonic influences that exist within international relations today.
Thank you very much, Adam. And thank you for your question. Well, your comments, Andy. Okay, Oliver, over to you. You want to change tack, is that right?
No, only slightly. Thanks a lot for that, Adam. Really enjoyed that, and it's a really helpful talk. You've mentioned the concept of subaltern a few times in your talk, and I'm just wondering how important you believe this concept is to understanding the dynamics of class struggle, because it is a concept that's been criticized by people like James Petrus. He kind of calls it a catch-all term that doesn't doesn't recognize the specific dynamics of class struggle. What's your view on this?
So I've read quite a lot of James Petrus, but not recently. And to be honest, when you stop reading James Petrus, you then have to play a game of developmental catch up yourself, because he produces so much, or did produce so much, that you're way behind the curve. So I'm not sure what piece you're referring to, but I guess for me, and people will have their own views about Gramsci and the treatment of subaltern classes within his work. But for me, Gramsci is really a theorist of agency, but of class agency. So, my personal predilection is that it's an extremely useful concept for widening the optic of agency, but still through a class-based form of analysis. Now, if people then drop the class and they just refer to subaltern agency, then we start to get into that slippage or that sanitization that I mentioned in the rounded discussions with Andy. So in the hands of CLR James and Selma James, who was a big influence, I think, on CLR James in affirming the significance of feminist struggles, particularly given James's own kind of dubious personal biography. That focus on subaltern self-activity is really, really important. And it's a term, the self-activity, subaltern class self-activity is one that Selma James really injects and invigorates into CLR James's work. So for me, it comes back to that focus on class. It's an important concept, the subaltern, but only if it's inflected in widening the optic of agency in relation to class agency, if that helps.
Okay, thank you very much. Oliver, are you happy with that, or would you want to?
No, yeah, that's fun. That's fantastic. Cheers.
Okay. Yeah, you'll have to educate me on what James Petrus's argument is, maybe another time. Yeah.
Or even now, if nobody asks another question.
Yeah. It's an invitation.
Well, no, he calls it essentially a kind of catch-all term that doesn't really engage with, the specifics of class struggle. But I suppose we do need to use a term to capture the various dynamics of class struggle without focusing on, for example, the working class or campesino struggles, etc. So no, that was really helpful.
That raises a very general point, doesn't it, about sort of categories and levels of abstraction or generalization. I think. I mean, there's no need, I don't think, to associate the word subordinate with the concept of class. I mean, presumably there are other types of subordinate in addition to those which we would associate with the notion of class. But as you say, I mean, even the concept of class is relatively general or abstract in relation to other concepts. It's more abstract than working class, for example, isn't it? I mean, it's sort of so there's an issue there about just how one uses general concepts when we're the ones engaging in theoretical work, and what is the appropriate level at which to pitch the discussion. Not too general, as you're suggesting, but not too specific either, I guess.
Yeah, Chris just dropped it in the chat, an important reference to Marcus Green's work as a contemporary interpreter of Gramsci on subalternity. But if we think generally about Andreas's work on social reproduction and water struggles, for example, it widens the optic beyond struggles in the workplace to look at the sphere of social reproduction more broadly. And I know Chris is working on political class formation, again in broadening the optic of what it means to think through conditions of class struggle. So really, I think what the notion of subaltern class self-activity does is it speaks to those issues of political class formation, of social reproduction, and widens the optics, simply from struggles in the workplace to address, social reproduction more broadly. And that's really what's so interesting about that relationship, which was a difficult relationship, for example, between Selma James and CLR James. Selma James is a feminist thinker, for those that might not know, who was directly engaged in the Wages for Housework campaign with Maria Rosa Della Costa and other feminist activist scholars. So really, that's kind of what I'm up to there, Oliver, with that set of arrangements.
Perhaps one issue here is, I mean, the idea of the subaltern, it's very much associated with Spivak, isn't it? Let the subaltern speak, and so is post-structuralism, and that's commonly thought to be a way of thinking which some people adopt because they're critical of Marxism. So it just seems a little bit odd for some people, anyway, that somebody who's sympathetic to Marxism might feel that it was appropriate to use this concept. I find it a useful one. Yeah. It seems sort of mixing your theoretical frameworks in an unhappy way, I guess, for some people anyway.
Yeah, and I think sometimes that gets in the paper. I mentioned this term criticism in the form of parody, and I think sometimes that that's how these concepts get taken and are developed. So the subaltern, I think, had that sort of treatment in a way, but in the hands of Gramsci and others, there's clearly a widening of the optic that's always already present in the work that can sustain, I think, the sorts of analysis in widening that optic, as I've mentioned. Yeah, and that term criticism in the form of parody, by the way, is Alfredo Sardfilo's and in his important book on Marxist Capital with Ben Fine.
Okay. So I can't see anybody else's. You said something I thought was interesting about C.L.R. James's dubious personal biography. No, I don't know anything about C.L.R. James, so I'm not into gossip, so don't feel the need to elaborate on this if you don't want to. But what did you mean when you talked about C.L.R. James's dubious personal biography?
Yeah, so he was a terrible womanizer. This comes through quite clearly in terms of particularly Eric Williams's recent biography. So as part of this project, I've endeavoured to read, obviously, not only the works of C.L.R. James, and I reread also all of E.H. Carr's. Well, I say all of E.H. Carr's. I didn't read the 14 volumes on the history of the Soviet Union. There are limits. But as part of that endeavor, I thought it was important also to get to know the person in terms of biography. And there are some really good intellectual and personal biographies on C.L.R. James as such an important figure. And it's quite shocking, actually, in terms of the contemporary Me Too movement, to get an understanding of C.L.R. James's proclivities and how he viewed research assistants, domestic workers, and it was all clearly read through the lens of patriarchy. So that's quite an uncomfortable read, I think. And many of his relationships with those female researchers, assistants, and partners were extremely dysfunctional. I think Selma James actually reveals a lot of that patriarchal lens to C.L.R. James himself, and in their own relationship, actually changed his thinking. Maybe not his behaviors, but certainly some of his thinking on those issues. So it's quite an uncomfortable journey, I think. Yeah,
that's a very important general issue, of course, isn't it?
Yeah.
The relationship between some of these ideas and the character, so it doesn't apply to C.L.R. James, of course. It's a general point. Okay, I can see that Mariana's been waiting very patiently. So.
Yeah, no, that's all right. Well, first of all, thank you very much. It's a fascinating story. So I'm coming into that. I'm not a political scientist, in fact, but I'm coming to that from a feminist theory perspective, if I may. And then, first of all, Andrew, a really fascinating talk, very interesting, the talk about the history of ideas, appropriation of ideas. But I will say with one point only. And of course, the purposeful erasure of certain influences, not just certain, the foundational influences, which is certainly exceeding the field of political economy or international relations per se. But I just wanted to ask you, to pick you up on this latest point that you made about them, caricature of criticisms, right? And you referred several times to some Selma James and the reproductive labor theory with Silvia Federici, who was a collaborator of Selma James and other people in the 70s when they started this wage for homework, etc. But not just that. I just want to say that in my personal reading, I think that this radical autonomist Marxist feminists, I don't think they offer the caricature of Marx, but they rather, if I may, they rather actually kind of highlighted well, the missed aspect, I would say, between what constitutes productive labor as per profit generation or profit extraction, and what is the non-productive and the reproductive labor, the unpaid work, and therefore not valued. So all I want to say is that even when the host, sorry, I forget, Tony, when Tony says that some people would disagree with Spivak's take on subaltern, I think that, and I'm certainly coming from a completely different perspective. I work in a business school and I teach ethics, right? So completely different view. But I use these frameworks to understand the resistance against anti-mining, the resistance against extractivist mining. Sorry. So, and I find this both Marxist, but specifically the feminist reproductive labor's reading of Marx, to understand the issues like missed issues like embodiment, like affect. And it is not just to caricature Marx. I'm not saying that that's what you said. I'm just putting this out for you. What do you think about that? Yeah, sorry, very lengthy and maybe a little bit a muddled a kind of question. But does actually, my question basically is, does bringing frameworks from, I don't know, post-structuralism or reproductive labor, I mean, if these feminists like Salma James, they tell us that subaltern and class consciousness is an intersectional issue. It's not just one or the other. So they can only enrich rather than actually, you know, kind of undermine the key premises of big founding fathers or big founding thinkers, really, not fathers. Rosa Luxemburg is not a father. Sorry, I stop here. Yeah.
So Mariana, that's a great it's a great question, and it gives me the opportunity maybe to expand on a couple of influences here, but maybe to start with your own mapping of some of those intellectual trajectories. Federici, I think, is really crucial. You know, when I first read Caliban and the Witch, I actually thought it was literally a kind of revolutionary change in my focus on the condition of primitive accumulation, in the way in which she reveals the agency that of female struggles over the body and how they were subjected to the witch hunts. So it's a really important text. We can then get into kind of, you know, differences about the conclusions of that book, but Federici, I think, along with Salma James, Mariana Rosa della Costa are really crucial. And I would add into that as well Leopoldina Fortunati as coming out of that radical autonomista Marxism. And Fortunati's book is again a little bit neglected, to be honest. It's out of print. It's hard to get hold of. There is a project, I think, to try and crowdfund the text to release a new edition and a new translation. Apparently, the translation from Italian to English is not good, so I'm told anyway. So I think you know, in terms of looking at social reproduction, there's a number of classic sources now that one can turn to, which would get beyond criticism in the form of parody, but then you know, a contemporary swathe of literature, and in particular, I obviously highlight the work that comes out of thinkers like Tithi Bhattacharya and Susan Ferguson, and also David McNally in that company. And what's interesting about that more contemporary work is the way in which they would actually ditch intersectionality, maybe associated with more post-colonial or post-structural frames of reference. They would ditch into intersectionality precisely because it evokes this notion of trying to combine categories and concepts and conditions that are separated and then conjoin them for a focus on internal relations. So with their, you know, whether it be David McNally or Tithi Bhattacharya, with their focus on dialectics, they're looking at race and class and gender as internally related. So I think that's an interesting debate that builds maybe on those forethinkers that you were alluding to. Hopefully that speaks to your question.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, thank you very much, Marianne. You seem to have disappeared. Have you? Yeah, I don't know. Anyway, okay. Any more for any more? I can't see any hands at all. I hate situations. It's like being in a room with students, isn't it? How long can you actually sort of hold the silence and shame people into actually? Well, perhaps. All right. So if there aren't, then there we are. I think I've said enough, so I'm not going to. And I should think you want your breakfast, do you? I should.
Second breakfast, maybe. Yeah.
Oh no. So Andreas is applauding rather than putting a hand up to ask a question. Yes. All right. Okay. Let's call it a halt then. And thank you very much, Adam. And we'll thank Adam in the usual manner by putting the hands up. That was terrific. It was very enjoyable. Yeah. Thank you.
Many thanks for hosting me, and and good luck to CSSGJ now in its new history as well. And I was saying to Oliver when we were just getting warmed up that I probably wouldn't ordinarily do these sorts of gigs presenting at 5 a.m. but getting up at 4 to make sure I have some breakfast if it wasn't for CSSGJ. So good luck with the next round of social engagements, public dissemination, and changing the world.
Well, thank you very much. You've done us a big favor getting up at 4 in the morning. I'm sure we certainly appreciate that as well as the talk. All right. Okay. Let's signing off. Thank you very much. Take care. Bye.
Good luck, comrades.
Bye-bye.